She looked beautiful. Too beautiful to be a coincidence. Skin-tight red dress, high heels, perfectly wavy hair. As if she wanted to be noticed. As if he knew someone special would be watching. And, indeed, it was. It just wasn't who she expected. When our eyes met, she froze. The smile on his face melted like a candle in the wind. Beside her, a man. Not just anyone. Tall, self-confident, with a well-cut suit and the expression of someone who thought he was on top of the world. His hand rested on her waist. Intimacy. Comfort. That kind of touch that can't be rehearsed. That only exists when there is trust. He saw me later. He hesitated. Tried to disguise it. But the body doesn't lie. His eyes widened, he pulled his hand away, as if it suddenly burned. She was left breathless. A silent panic crossed his face. The kind of despair that doesn't scream, but begs for an invisible miracle. I walked towards her, calmly, with the dignity of someone who has already cried in silence everything they had to cry. I got close to his ear and whispered, "I'm glad you revealed your true self. Now I'm going to move on with my life." But the truth, even when spoken with class, hurts like a blade. And what I said that night, despite the serenity of my voice, was the sound of a heart burned to the end. Nobody saw what came next. No one imagined that, at that elegant party, between toasts and fake laughter, a soul would be torn apart inside. Because the pain of betrayal is not in the act itself. It's in the preparation, in the small signs ignored, in the trust given, in the unreserved love. It's in the dinners planned with care, in the surprises organized with dedication, in the notes left on the breakfast table. It's in the enchanted look of someone who believes they are truly loved. She thought she was safe. So confident that she had the audacity to go to the corporate event where, supposedly, there would only be coworkers, with the man who stole from me behind my back. A party I helped organize myself, without knowing it was setting the stage for my own emotional breakdown. I spent weeks complimenting her on the dress she chose, suggesting hairstyles, listening excitedly to her ideas for the event. She smiled, hugged me, told me she loved me, and maybe she meant it. Which makes everything even more cruel. Because loving and still betraying requires a level of coldness that the common heart does not understand. But she understood. And he executed it. I knew. Not from that night. But before. The signs started out subtle. Lost looks in the middle of dinner. Messages on cell phones read in a hurry and deleted too quickly. A new perfume, a new mood, a new routine. She became someone else. And I, stupid, applauded the change, thinking it was evolution. That was her blooming. It was. But not for me. It was for him. The first confirmation came on a Saturday. She said she was going to visit a friend she hadn't seen in a while. I, confidently, even suggested that he take the opportunity to relax. But intuition, that damn late ally, made me follow it. And there he was. Sitting in the car. Open door for her. Kiss on the cheek with the intimacy of someone who has already explored every inch of her body. When they left together, my chest burned. But I didn't go there. I didn't make a scene. I returned home with my stomach upset, my heart clogged with poison and my mind determined to know how far she would be able to go. And it went far. As far as her ego would allow. Every day she came back lighter, more willing, more alive. Because he, unlike me, didn't bring tickets. He brought wine, a motel, and pretty lies. I was the port. He, the exciting storm. But she forgot that ports can also become hurricanes. And that night, when she saw me, she realized that her life was about to be turned upside down. The irony? She went to the event with him thinking I wouldn't show up. That I had declined the invitation. But fate is sadistic. Just that night, a partner from the company invited me at the last minute. He said my presence was essential. I hesitated. But I went. And when I saw her, she wasn't just a wife anymore. She was a decadent actress about to have her show closed. For me. There was something comical in his expression. A theatrical horror, as if there was still a chance to hide the truth. But the truth doesn't hide after she screams. And at that moment, she screamed at her eyes, at her lover's posture, at the distance they both took between themselves as soon as they saw me. They became strangers to each other, as if that could erase everything. But it didn't turn off. And I was there to prove it. She tried to smile. He trembled. He almost tripped. And him? Coward. He barely dared to look at me. Maybe he remembered a conversation in which he praised me. Maybe he thought I would never find out. But there I was, in front of the two, with the firm eyes of someone who no longer had anything to lose. I said what I had to say. And I turned my back. But what she didn't know, and what he could never imagine, was that that night was just the beginning of the real nightmare. Because while she lay on fake sheets, I prepared the stage for her return. Because the biggest mistake of those who betray is thinking that the betrayed will remain broken. Some do. Others are reborn. I was reborn. And I came back. Not like the man they betrayed. But as the man who would change history. Because that event, that company, that world, everything was part of something much bigger than they could imagine. The party was just the stage. The final act was yet to come. And what no one expected was that, between toasts and confessions, someone that night carried more power than everyone present combined. Me. And when I reappeared, weeks later, in the boardroom, with a document in my hands and a name on my badge that chilled both of our spines, I understood that revenge is not just about destroying the other. It's about showing that you survived better without it. But what happened after that night still surprises me to this day. Because what seemed like a perfect revenge plan turned into something even more painful, and liberating. What if I told you that someone there besides me was also faking it from the beginning? That the lover, the great hero of his free time, was not who he said he was? And that there was a third person involved who knew everything and watched silently, waiting for the right moment to act? There is much more behind the look on her face at that party. Much more behind the calm with which I walked towards her. And no matter how low my voice was, my gesture was an earthquake in both of their lives. What they did to me that night, I will never forget. But what happened to them afterwards, perhaps not even destiny itself would have the courage to write. And now, you need to know what happened the next day. Because this story doesn't end with the sentence I said in her ear. It just started there. Welcome to the channel. Here, we make it clear from the beginning, we do not support and will never romanticize betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictitious, but based on real pain, created to show, without filters, how betrayal destroys lives, families and hearts. The moral is simple, every choice has a price. Get ready. What will you hear now? It's not just a story, it's a reality check. Good listening. David and Laura seemed like the perfect portrait of a life built on patience, love, and conscious choices. Together for more than 11 years, they had met at university. He was studying administration with an ambitious gleam in his eyes and she was immersed in psychology, carrying a sweet smile, but an internal strength that attracted attention from the first day. The two had in common the desire to build something solid. No overwhelming and chaotic passions, no unnecessary dramas. David always said that loving was an exercise in constancy, and Laura, with her serenity, used to add that loving was also about listening to the other's silence. They chose themselves when they could have chosen haste. They got married after 4 years of dating, in a rustic garden at dusk, with promises made with closed eyes and whole hearts. Their life together began in a small rented apartment and went up step by step to the house they now shared in a leafy neighborhood, full of children running on the sidewalks and neighbors who waved early in the morning with coffee in hand. David worked as director of operations at a logistics solutions company. He had climbed with effort, taking advantage of every opportunity, always discreet, always efficient. He was one of those men who didn't need to impose himself to be respected, his presence was enough. The employees admired him not only for his competence, but for the humanity with which he treated each situation. He never screamed. He never acted on impulse. He was a strategist by nature, both in his professional and personal life. At home, he was the type of husband who remembered dates, prepared coffee in bed on Sundays and made a point of saying, "I love you," even on routine days. Laura, in turn, had built a solid career as a clinical therapist. She had a cozy office that she had decorated with warm tones and paintings that evoked calm and introspection. He had a generous listening attitude, a patience that was almost a sacred virtue. He took care of others with deep dedication and, at home, he knew how to balance affection and independence like few others. Together, they created a dynamic that was respectful and admired by those around them. There were never screams inside that house. Fights were contained discussions, more rational than passionate. And perhaps this was, without them realizing it, the first indication that the flame that united them was slowly turning into warm embers. The silent dinners, the rarer laughs, the bed that, little by little, stopped being a place of desire and became just a place of rest. There was no explicit unhappiness, but there was an absence that was difficult to name. As if they were both trying to sustain a happiness that was no longer spontaneous. But they insisted. Because they both had principles. Because giving up was not an option. Because they still deeply respected each other. Laura, in recent years, had immersed herself more intensely in her work. The office was doing well, the waiting list grew, invitations to lectures increased and, as a result, the agenda became increasingly full. David supported, encouraged, but felt that the time between the two had become scarce and formal. He started coming home late from work. He started attending company events, happy hours that he previously avoided. Not because I was unhappy, but because I was trying to fill a void I couldn't name. At home, Laura observed these changes with a mixture of acceptance and strangeness. Didn't charge. I knew he needed the space. But in silence, she missed a look that desired her like before. A touch that wasn't automatic. Of long conversations on the couch that had been swallowed up by routine. Life continued with apparent stability. Short trips for two, gifts on birthdays, dinners on commemorative dates. To outside eyes, they were still the couple everyone admired. Inside, they began to inhabit parallel worlds. David kept everything to himself, as he always did. He didn't complain, he didn't ask. I just hoped that time would correct what seemed out of alignment. Laura, in turn, gave herself to the care as if, by healing other people's pain, she was able to escape her own. Nights became long. The silence, deafening. But neither of them had the courage to name what was growing between them, a silent abyss, fueled by good breeding and the fear of rupture. There was still affection. They laughed together when they watched their favorite old movies. They shared their taste for wine and exchanged book recommendations. But love had settled. Like a guest who doesn't want to disturb you. Who lives in the corners, without making any noise. A love without urgency. No scandals. But also without that restlessness that makes the heart race. David, at many times, tried to rekindle the fire. I booked dinners, surprised people with flowers, organized little getaways to the coast on the weekends. Laura smiled, thanked him, gave herself to the gestures. But there was something in his gaze that escaped. As if part of her was somewhere else. A place that not even she herself fully understood. The routine continued. Monday to Friday, breakfast in a hurry, quick messages during the day, dinner almost always at 9 at night, and the bed shared with an invisible distance. David began to write. Short texts, rants. Things I would never have the courage to say out loud. He kept everything in an old notebook hidden in his desk drawer. Laura sometimes cried alone in the bathroom, without knowing exactly why. It was like everything was fine, but still, it wasn't. She started going to the building's gym more often. He said it was to take care of his health, but there was something more to this sudden habit. New colleagues, new perspectives. New compliments. And then, an invitation. A big party for David's company, celebratory, refined. It would be in a 5-star hotel, with a full buffet, live music, guests from senior management and their respective partners. David commented casually to Laura, expecting perhaps a little more enthusiasm than usual. She smiled, but hesitated before accepting. She said she would be tired that week, but that she would see if she could organize herself. He didn't insist. He said that if she didn't want to go, he would understand. But I hoped she would. And Laura went. She chose her dress in advance, spent hours in the ballroom on the day of the event, and when she entered the ballroom, it was impossible not to notice her presence. The stage was set. Soft lights, ambient music, clinking glasses, lively conversations. David arrived a little later, involved in organizational details, greeting colleagues, offering formal smiles. I didn't expect that night to change everything. I didn't know that, amidst the luxury and good intentions, an uncomfortable truth would begin to whisper in the hallways. But he felt it. Something in the air. A discomfort that I couldn't name. When he saw Laura, the world seemed to stop for a moment. And although the scene that would mark his life had not yet happened, his heart, which had been suspicious for weeks of an absence that he could not explain, began to prepare for something that he did not yet know, but that would forever change the course of his story. And in that room, between forced laughter and banal conversations, destiny was already preparing its next move. A silent movement. Painful. But necessary. Because not all love survives time. And not every love story ends as it began. Some collapse in silence. Others, in front of an audience. But all of them, without exception, carry an exact moment when everything changes. And that moment was about to happen. That evening, David watched the guests spread out across the room with the lightness that the refined atmosphere inspired. The aroma of champagne mixed with expensive perfumes and artificial laughter. It was a scenario carefully staged to impress, to create fond memories that would be talked about in the company hallways for weeks. He walked between the groups naturally, greeting familiar faces, delivering strategic smiles, observing everything with the eyes of someone who, for years, had known the behind-the-scenes of events like that. His name was circulated with respect and admiration, not only for his competence, but for his discretion. He was known for being the kind of man who always maintained his composure, even when chaos threatened behind the scenes. The type of leader who listened before acting. And that made him someone respected. Maybe even feared. Laura arrived on time, as always. The black dress fitted to the body, hair tied up elegantly, sober makeup, attentive eyes. When she entered, David saw her from afar and couldn't help the discreet tightness in his chest. She looked beautiful. And there was a glow about her that I hadn't seen in a while. For a moment, I wanted to believe that that glow was from him. That maybe, somehow, that festive meeting would bring back the freshness of the early years, when they danced without music and laughed at silly jokes just for the pleasure of laughing together. He approached her naturally, offered her a glass of wine, kissed her face with the delicacy of someone who respects spaces and limits. She returned the gesture with a restrained but sincere smile. They chatted briefly, talked about their colleagues, the decor, the menu. And then, as always happened at these events, she walked away to greet acquaintances while he was called to talk to investors. Throughout the night, David alternated between diplomatic dialogues and discreet glances at Laura. There was something about his posture that didn't go unnoticed. A slight restlessness, an increased attention to the cell phone, a hidden smile when he looked discreetly across the room. He tried to ignore it. He tried to rationalize. But, as the hours passed, the discomfort turned into an insistent doubt. He felt out of place, as if he were out of touch with his own reality. It was as if he were participating in a play in which all the actors knew the script except him. At one point, upon returning from a brief conversation with the company's CEO, David saw Laura near the outside area of the salon, in a less lit corner. She was accompanied by a man he didn't immediately recognize. Tall, confident posture, dark suit, gaze fixed on her. Laura smiled. A different smile. A smile he knew from ancient times, but hadn't seen for a long time. The kind of smile that is not born out of politeness, but out of desire. The man held a glass and leaned slightly towards him as he spoke. Laura touched his arm. A quick, almost imperceptible touch. But for David, it was like a bolt of lightning ripping through his chest. His blood ran cold. Time seemed to stop. He didn't react immediately. He took a deep breath. He walked in another direction, trying to regain control. He talked to a group of colleagues, pretended to be attentive, laughed mechanically. But the mind was there, trapped in that image. He tried to convince himself that it was just an impression. That it was just a coincidence. That Laura was an adult, that she could talk to whoever she wanted. But the truth was already forming in his consciousness, even though he tried to resist it. Later that evening, when the formal speeches began, David sat at the high table. Laura was not by his side. He sent a message asking where she was. No response. He looked around. Nothing. He went to the bathroom, went through the bar, through the outside area. Nothing. Just as he was about to return to the table, he heard muffled laughter coming from a private area at the back of the room. A dark, almost empty corridor. Something in him made him walk there. An instinct. An impulse he couldn't ignore. The scene he encountered there was not explosive. There were no open kisses or explicit caresses. There was Laura, sitting next to the man from before, their faces dangerously close, whispering words that seemed too intimate to be shared with a simple colleague. Their hands almost touched. The looks didn't go away. And at that moment, David didn't need any more proof. Betrayal doesn't scream. She whispers. And the whisper he heard was louder than any scream that could have come out of anyone's mouth. David walked away in silence. Didn't confront. He didn't react. He returned to the hall, smiled at the guests, thanked them for their compliments, toasted the directors. But inside, everything had already collapsed. The stomach turned. The chest burned. The mind spun like a silent tornado. He didn't know what was worse, the pain of having seen it or the certainty that she wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Laura returned to the table some time later. He disguised it well. He said he had gone to the bathroom, that he had met an old friend and got lost in the conversation. David listened in silence, his gaze fixed on the bottom of his glass. I knew that there, at that moment, something was broken forever. But he didn't show it. Because there was something inside him that he still needed to understand. There were still doubts. There was still a glimmer of hope that everything was just a huge mess. But his body already knew. And silence, that old companion, became his only answer again. That same night, back at home, he watched her enter her room and lightly take off her earrings. Laura talked about the event, the decoration, the music. He pretended normality with a mastery that scared him. He just nodded. He took a shower, lay down and stayed there, looking at the ceiling. He smelled her perfume still clinging to the pillow. A new perfume. A smell he didn't recognize. And at that moment, everything made sense. The change in gestures, the delays, the empty smiles, the formal hugs. He was no longer part of her narrative. He was just an extra in a story she rewrote alone. In the days that followed, David said nothing. He continued with the routine, with the commitments, with the forced smiles. But inside, something was born. Something he himself still didn't fully understand. A silent strength, a desire to change the game. He started observing more, listening more, connecting loose ends. And the more he connected, the more he saw that the story was bigger than it seemed. There was something hidden. Something that didn't just reveal itself in betrayal. Something that Laura didn't say, that perhaps not even her lover knew. And he needed to know what it was before he acted. It was during this period that David resumed an old project. Something left on standby, dormant for years. A subtle, strategic move. He began attending discreet meetings, recovering old contacts, organizing documents. Meanwhile, Laura continued living her new version, believing that everything was under control. But it wasn't. She didn't know that David had already understood everything. And now, the game had changed. Because when trust is broken, there is no going back. But there is a return. And some returns are silent, cold, planned with surgical precision. And when Laura, weeks later, decided to go with her lover to the company's new get-together, the one where she thought David would never appear, she had no idea that her biggest mistake was about to be made. And it would be that night, in front of everyone, that the mask would fall. But what she least imagined was that David, the betrayed man, wasn't just another guest. He was, without anyone knowing, the new name behind the decision-making table. And what he would say in her ear that night, would be just the beginning. Because there was a secret that had not yet been revealed. And this secret would change everything. The hall was full. Laughter echoed through the hallways, the soft sound of jazz filled the room with an elegant charm, and toasts were already beginning to clink between excited hands. The event was bigger, more luxurious, more symbolic than any other organized by the company. Everything had been prepared months in advance to mark a new phase. The success of the recent merger with a large international group brought profound changes and high expectations. No detail was left to chance. From the lighting to the menu designed by an award-winning chef, everything screamed sophistication. And in the middle of all this, between formal dresses and impeccable suits, Laura crossed the room next to Thomas, the man for whom she had exchanged the stability of a story for an unresolved desire. They were there together, as if nothing needed to be hidden. As if the truth weren't a knife about to fall. Thomas walked beside her with the typical arrogance of someone who believes the game is won. Laura was smiling discreetly, her eyes trying to look natural, but there was tension in the air. A type of energy that she couldn't name, but that was beginning to bother her. Maybe it was the look of some colleagues, maybe David's absence, maybe the fact that they were in a place where he could, yes, appear. But she chose to go anyway. I believed he wouldn't dare. That he would have enough dignity to keep his distance, to preserve appearances. But he was wrong. And deeply. When David walked in, there was no announcement. No fanfare. Just the silent strength of his presence. An impeccably tailored dark suit, a serene face, a steady gaze, and a slight smile on his lips. He walked with a new confidence, as if he were carrying an irreversible secret on his back. The eyes turned to him. Some in respect, others in surprise. There were rumors about his return to the board, but nothing had been confirmed. Just whispers. Until that moment. And when the master of ceremonies took the stage to announce the company's new executive structure, his name was the last to be pronounced. The new position was clear. Majority managing partner. Now it was up to him to decide. He was the one in command. And there was no one else above. Laura felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The cup shook in his hand. He tried to look at Thomas for some reaction, but he remained static, with his eyes fixed on David, as if he was also beginning to realize that something much bigger was going on. The past they had betrayed now watched them from above. David didn't look away. He walked straight up to them. One step at a time, with the calm of someone who had already rehearsed that scene thousands of times in the silence of sleepless nights. When he stopped in front of the two, he greeted Thomas with a restrained but firm gesture. And then he looked at Laura. The seconds felt like hours. He approached her slowly, placed his lips against her ear and said, in a low and precise voice, each syllable like a surgical cut, I'm glad you revealed who you really were. Now I'm going to move on with my life." Laura couldn't respond. His eyes were teary, his face was paralyzed, his breath caught in his chest. David walked away, turned his back and walked to the stage. He calmly took the microphone and thanked everyone for coming. He spoke about the new phase, about new beginnings, about integrity. No attacks, no provocations. But every word was a subtle warning that the tables had turned. And that he was no longer the man betrayed in silence. Now he was the architect of truth. When the ceremony ended, the guests dispersed among tables and hallways, and Laura ran to him. I wanted answers. I wanted to understand how long he had known. As I had discovered. How he had the strength not to confront her before. He found him on the hotel terrace, away from people, contemplating the city with the silence of someone who has already cried everything he needed to cry. She approached carefully. He called his name. He didn't turn around right away. He took a deep breath. Then, finally, he looked at her. Laura tried to speak, but David was direct. He said he knew everything. That he had seen with his own eyes. That nothing needed to be explained. That what she did was done, and that nothing would erase it. But what would come now was not revenge. It was justice. And then she realized there was more. That sudden rise was no coincidence. That return to the top was filled with a silent purpose. She tried to argue, to say that she was confused, that it wasn't simple, that their marriage had turned into something she no longer recognized. But David was unmoved. His eyes, even though they didn't carry anger, were icy. She said that love died the moment she chose to lie. And from then on, their lives would follow opposite paths. Laura cried. Tried to touch him. He asked them to at least talk, to try to understand. But he was just grateful for the time they had together. He said that, despite everything, he was still grateful for the good times. But there was no room for her in the new story he was writing. Then, before leaving, he left an envelope in her hands. She asked that she only open it when she was alone. And he left. That night, Laura went up to the hotel room where she was staying with Thomas. Head spinning, heart in pieces. He was waiting for her on the sofa, anxious, tense. She asked what David had said, but she could barely form sentences. He sat on the edge of the bed, opened the envelope with shaking hands. And there, among the carefully organized papers, was the truth. David had not just taken control of the company. He had silently bought Thomas's shares, the very ones he thought he confidently controlled. The contract was there, with dates, signatures, clauses. Thomas had sold his share to a third party, without knowing that third party was David. And now, the man he had betrayed became his direct boss. Thomas's expression changed from shock to panic. He took the papers, read each line, sweating. I asked how, when, why. Laura didn't respond. I just watched him slowly fall apart. And in that instant, he realized that David had done something more than fight back. He had won. And won with elegance. No public humiliation, no scandals. Just facts. With strategy. With silence. Thomas's breathing quickened. The tension in the room was palpable. He said he needed to leave, that he couldn't believe it, that he had been tricked. And it was. He left hurriedly, dazed, leaving Laura alone with the papers spread across the bed. She looked at everything like someone watching a house of cards collapse. None of that was in the plans. He believed he dominated the narrative. That could continue with two parallel worlds. But he forgot that the world has a cruel way of putting everything in order. Laura cried for the first time without control. Not for the loss of Thomas. Not even for the job that was now threatened. He cried because, in that envelope, was the end. A silent but absolute end. And what she still didn't know was that, the next morning, she would receive more than one answer. I would receive the revelation of something even deeper. Something that would change her understanding of everything. Because the most brutal secret, the one that David kept until the last second, had not yet been revealed. And when it was, no tears would be enough. The next day dawned heavy. The light that passed through the hotel windows seemed to mock the awkward silence that spread between the crumpled sheets and the papers scattered on the room's floor. Laura woke up alone, with her face still damp from tears that had dried on the pillow during the morning. The weight of the previous night gave him no respite. The envelope now sat on the dresser, open, cruel in its simplicity. Each line read, each clause of that contract seemed to spit in his face the reality he had refused to see. She tried to remember the signs, the moments when she might have realized that David was moving beyond the silence of pain, that he was planning something bigger, something definitive. But he was perfect. He didn't scream, he didn't beg, he didn't react like a betrayed man. He reacted like a strategist. And that's what destroyed her more than any scandal could. She went down to breakfast with short steps, avoiding stares. He knew that many there had witnessed his disguised humiliation the night before. I knew that David's name now echoed with strength and respect behind the corporate scenes. And hers was beginning to be associated with distrust, speculation, silent judgments. She found herself sitting in front of a cup of cold coffee, unable to drink, just staring at the dark liquid as if there was an answer there. But there wasn't. What there was an uncomfortable emptiness. And a regret that I didn't know how to contain. Meanwhile, in another corner of the city, David maintained his routine with the coolness of someone who learned to control the storm from within. He arrived at the office without fanfare, greeted the employees with respect, and entered his new office as if entering home. There was something about the way he walked, the calmness with which he organized his agenda, that bothered those who knew the story. They expected a man in ruins, but found someone reconstructed. What no one knew, however, was that behind that posture there were sleepless nights, torn texts, contained anger and suffocated longings. But David had made a choice, not to be a slave to pain. And as much as it still hurt, as much as part of him still remembered Laura's laughter on the good days, he knew it wouldn't come back. I couldn't. Later, in the late afternoon of that same Monday, Laura showed up at the company. She wore a simple dress, no makeup, her hair hastily tied up. He asked to speak to David. The secretary hesitantly called him. He agreed to receive it. When she entered, her eyes met a silence that screamed louder than any words. She sat down uninvited, trying to maintain her dignity. He began by saying that he wasn't there to apologize, because he knew that the words were no longer valuable. But I wanted to understand how he achieved all that. How he had the strength to engineer her fall without her realizing it. And if at some point, even with everything, there was still love. David took a deep breath. He said that loving wasn't enough when trust died. That planning his reaction was not revenge, but a survival mechanism. Who didn't want to destroy anyone, but needed to save himself. He said that love had turned into self-respect. And now what I felt was just gratitude for having survived the lie. Laura lowered her eyes. He said he had gotten lost. That he had sought outside what he no longer found inside. Who became confused between lack and desire, between routine and abandonment. But she never imagined he would be able to look into her eyes with so much control after all. David smiled slightly and said that pain teaches silence, and silence teaches strength. They stayed there, face to face, for a few minutes. She even tried to recover something that no longer existed. He said he could leave the company, as he didn't want to harm his image. He replied that he didn't need it. That she should decide for herself. That his image was already formed. She then asked, bluntly, if there was anyone else. David didn't respond right away. He got up, went to the window, observed the city for a few seconds. And then, in a low voice, he said no. That there was still no space. That his heart still healed. But one day, perhaps, he would allow himself to start over. And that when that happened, it wouldn't be angry. It would be with peace. Laura left the room with the weight of someone who had lost something they didn't know was so precious. As he descended the elevator, he was met with looks that now seemed more judgmental than curious. She felt small. Fragile. Unrecognizable. He got in the car, drove aimlessly, parked in front of a park and stayed there for hours, remembering his first years with David. The letters left on the table, the long hugs on cold nights, the conversations during the early hours of the morning. And he wondered where he lost the ability to love like that. There was no response. Just tears. On the other side, David also faced his own questions. I knew I had won, but the victory was accompanied by loneliness. There was no longer anyone waiting for him at home. There was no longer laughter in the kitchen, nor the sound of footsteps when opening the door. The house was tidy, too quiet, as if it no longer belonged to him. It was a new beginning, but also an end. He turned on the radio, let some music play, sat down on the sofa and closed his eyes. And there, alone, he felt something different from the pain that had consumed him for so long. He felt a beginning. A possibility. A clean space within himself that required no more explanations, no proof, no justification. For the first time in a long time, he felt peace. The next day, while the routine was rearranging itself, a new character crossed David's path. She was not a stunning woman, nor someone involved in corporate high society. She was discreet, intelligent, with a curious look and a voice that conveyed calm. Recently hired for a specific internal restructuring project, she brought with her a lightness that he hadn't seen in a long time. They talked about work, laughed about banal things, shared a coffee and, without realizing it, spent hours together discussing ideas, exchanging references, sharing life stories. At the end of the day, she asked if he wanted to continue the conversation elsewhere. He hesitated. For seconds, the memory of Laura crossed his mind. But then I said yes. Because at that moment, I knew that moving forward wasn't about forgetting the past. It was choosing not to live trapped by it. Meanwhile, Laura received a board meeting notification. The new leadership had decided to promote structural changes, and its position would be reviewed. There was no tone of punishment, just the necessary rigor of a new management. She understood. I knew that was the price. And he didn't question it. He got up, looked at his room with affection and sadness, packed his belongings and left. There was no longer any place there for the version of herself she had become. He walked slowly to the car, with his head high, but his heart heavy. On the way home, he thought about writing a letter to David. Not to ask for anything, but to say thank you. For showing her what it means to react with greatness. For giving her the chance, even after the mistake, to learn how to rebuild. And so, as time progressed, the paths continued parallel. A man who learned to love himself before loving again. A woman who lost everything, but began to find herself again. And life, with its silent irony, continued weaving the next chapters of a story that, although marked by pain, was now reborn with maturity. Because there are falls that don't destroy us. There are falls that wake us up. And what David had built with his pain now became the foundation of something new. Something that was yet to come. But it was already beginning to emerge. Days have passed since the last meeting between David and Laura, and what previously seemed like a constant echo of sorrows began to turn into a distant noise, muffled by new movements that time, always merciless and revealing, was responsible for bringing. The company, now under new leadership, took on new features. David's presence in the executive management began to generate structural changes that impacted the internal culture and made clear the intention of not only rebuilding the company's prestige, but of rewriting the rules that had been eroded by the silent negligence of previous years. He took the lead in decisions with mature firmness, and even though his name carried the weight of a story that everyone whispered in the corridors, there wasn't a single employee who didn't respect the serenity with which he now guided each step. People stopped to listen to him, not because they were afraid, but because they recognized that, behind his slow speech, there was someone who learned to be strong without ceasing to be human. It was in this new scenario, where people no longer saw him as a wounded man, but as a consolidated leader, that a journey emerged. An international event on innovation and sustainability in logistics was to be held in Madrid, and David was invited as a featured speaker. It was a symbolic opportunity, not just a professional one. It represented the milestone of a phase in which he was no longer remembered for the personal scandal that few dared to mention out loud, but rather was recognized for the competence that always defined him. He accepted the invitation without hesitation. He prepared diligently, aligned his team, delegated duties and embarked with a curious feeling of lightness. For the first time in a long time, he felt complete alone. Madrid welcomed him with wide, lively streets, vibrant architecture that seemed to dance between classic and modern, and a cool climate that made the mornings easier to breathe. The hotel where he stayed was elegant and discreet, exactly how he liked it. On the second day of the event, after his talk, he was approached by one of the organizers, a business consultant called Elena. She had watched his presentation attentively, and, when approaching him, she spoke with surprising conviction about how his speech had touched her, not only because of its technical lucidity, but because of the emotional charge that, although discreet, ran through his words. David smiled, thanked him, and the conversation continued in an unexpectedly natural way. They had lunch together in the convention center's restaurant, and then walked along the nearby avenues like two old acquaintances who had met again after years. Elena had a direct, blunt look and a sharp sense of humor. She had been a widow for 5 years and the mother of a teenager, and she spoke about life with a rare honesty. David, without realizing it, felt at ease, laughing at banal jokes, telling stories about his youth, talking about films, wines, and the hidden beauty of small things. There was no tension, no expectation. There was space. A clean space, where no pain was mandatory, where the past didn't need to be exposed to validate the present. At night, when David returned to the hotel, he did not think of Elena in a hurry, nor with any immediate desire. He thought of her with a calm curiosity. I wanted to get to know her better, and that was enough. Meanwhile, in her city, Laura faced a new stage with the wavering strength of someone walking on glass barefoot. I had decided not to continue with the company. He sent his letter of voluntary termination and began a painful process of reinvention. He looked for old contacts, resumed interrupted studies, and went back to therapy. But, more than anything, she sank into a forced silence that forced her to look inside. He was not looking for excuses, nor immediate redemption. He sought to understand why he allowed his identity to be diluted between unspoken needs and thoughtless decisions. Some nights, I wrote. Not romantic diaries, but raw reflections about herself, about her version as a woman, wife, lover, and now, survivor of her own fall. David's name appeared frequently on the pages, not as an object of longing, but as a mirror in which she had refused to see herself for too long. It was on one of these nights that she decided to write him a letter. Not to ask for anything, but to say what you never had the courage to say. He reread each line, reworking words, trimming excesses, cleaning away any trace of self-pity. In the end, he left the envelope blank, with just his name. He put it in the mail and didn't wait for a response. I felt that, even if he never opened it, he needed to have said it. And maybe, just maybe, that would free her from herself a little more. David received the letter at home after returning from his trip. It was already evening, and he had just opened a bottle of wine to toast the successful conclusion of the event alone. Read carefully, without rushing. In silence. He didn't cry, he didn't even smile. It just absorbed it. Laura's words had the exact weight of someone who understood, too late, the value of what they lost. But there was no appeal in the text. There was truth. And that was enough. He folded the paper and put it in a box along with other symbols of a story that, although hurt, had also been real. In the following days, he resumed his commitments with admirable tranquility. Little by little, he began to allow himself to go out more, accept invitations he had previously refused, explore new places within the city that seemed unknown even after years there. Elena continued to be present, lightly, exchanging messages, sending curious links, inviting him to a lecture here or a coffee there. They didn't talk about the past. They talked about now. And that made all the difference. In one of those conversations, she said something that resonated deeply with David: "We are not defined by what happened to us, but by how we choose to carry on afterwards." This phrase accompanied him for days, resonating in meetings, in silences in the car, on walks in the park. And it was with her in mind that he decided to do something unusual: invite Laura for coffee. Not for reconciliation, not for getting back together, but for closure. End with dignity. End with truth. She accepted the invitation with surprise, hesitation, but also with barely concealed relief. They met in a small, out-of-the-way café with a cozy decor. She arrived first. It was different. More sober, more restrained, but there was something new in her gaze. Something more honest. When David entered, their eyes met slowly. They sat down. They ordered coffee. They talked about small things at first. And then, finally, they said what needed to be said. Laura thanked him for reading the letter. He said he felt sincerity in her. She talked about her pain, her mistakes, about how the betrayal didn't start immediately, but much earlier, when she allowed the distance to become comfort. David listened without interrupting. Then he said that he didn't harbor hatred, that he had forgiven, not for her, but for himself. "Because I knew that carrying anger means allowing the past to continue dictating the present." She breathed a sigh of relief. He cried discreetly. He apologized one last time, not expecting a response. And then, they smiled. A small, sad, but true smile. When they left the coffee shop, the world seemed calmer. Each one followed an opposite sidewalk. They didn't say goodbye with hugs or promises. Just one last look. A look that now sealed everything. And as they walked in different directions, something broke for good. And something new, silently, began. Because some stories need to end with truth so that others can begin with freedom. And theirs, now, was finally ready to be left behind. Time passed like a breeze that does not announce storms, but slowly transforms the landscape. It didn't happen overnight, there were no epiphanies or spectacular upheavals, but rather a slow, almost imperceptible process, like the silent reconstruction of a city after an earthquake. David had returned from his trip with a new outlook. No longer marked only by pain, but also by the clarity of someone who survived a shipwreck without letting themselves drown. Elena's presence in his life grew naturally, without pressure, without empty promises, just with the truth of encounters that don't need to prove anything. Little by little, she became more than pleasant company. She became his confidant, his partner in silence, his accomplice in projects, his new choice. A mature, conscious love, which did not seek to replace the previous one, but to fill in a different way, with delicacy, the space that the wound left. David bought an apartment at the top of a discreet building, with huge windows that let the sun invade the rooms without asking for permission. There he built a new home, without rushing, with hand-picked paintings, plants scattered in the corners, books everywhere and a blue armchair that became his favorite place at the end of the day. He received visits from Elena, but kept the space as his personal sanctuary. He ran again in the mornings, took up old forgotten hobbies like drawing sketches in hardcover notebooks and playing the guitar on Friday nights. It was as if each small gesture was a brick in the foundation of a new story, quieter, but much more solid. Elena, in turn, was not the type of woman who was dazzled by positions or status. His own career was well underway, his son was growing up responsibly, and he had a clear vision of what he wanted for the future. He didn't charge, he didn't invade, he didn't pressure. He just walked alongside. And that was enough. Their relationship was not born of promises, but of sincere exchanges. And, together, they started to make plans that didn't involve labels or rush, just real projects, a trip for two at the end of the year, a joint business idea, a language course on Saturdays. Simple things, but for them, they meant freedom. Meanwhile, Laura was going through a much more dense process. After leaving his position at the company, he found himself facing a vacuum that had previously been filled by meetings, appointments, and an intense routine. It was difficult to admit that for a long time he stuck to his work so as not to face his own abysses. She began teaching at a small local university, where she was respected for her career and listened to attentively by the students. There, he found a new meaning. Exchanging experiences with young minds full of doubts and impulses gave him back a vitality he thought he had lost. She also started a support group for women who have faced traumatic breakups. He felt, little by little, that what he experienced could help other people start over with less guilt and more clarity. But not everything was reconciliation with life. Thomas, the man he risked everything for, met a more bitter fate. After the loss of the shares and the breakup with David, his reputation in the market collapsed. He tried to relocate to other companies, but rumors spread too quickly. The arrogance that once made him walk with his chest inflated became his sentence. And those who once fawned over him now avoided being associated with his name. He became involved in dubious negotiations and, months later, was the target of an investigation for tax irregularities. Laura didn't know the details, she just heard the echoes. I no longer looked for him, nor did I want to know his whereabouts. She understood that he had been a reflection of her own escape. And now, with his feet on the ground, he no longer wanted to live in the shadows. A year after everything, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, David received an unexpected call. He was the lawyer who handled the process of sharing the assets of the former marriage. I wanted to schedule one last meeting to finalize the legal procedures. It was just a formal procedure, but when he hung up, David felt a strange tightness in his chest. Not for Laura, but for everything that signature represented. It was the definitive end of an era. And, at the same time, the official seal of your new life. On the appointed day, she dressed simply, arrived punctually, and entered the meeting room with the serenity of someone who knows exactly where she is. Laura was already there. He exchanged a brief look with him, a nod. The lawyer explained the last details, they signed the papers, and then they remained silent for a few seconds. She was the one who broke the ice. He said that, no matter how much he had made a mistake, he had no regrets, and that he sincerely hoped that he would be happy. David responded matter-of-factly that he didn't want her to pay for anything more than what she had already faced. He said everyone makes mistakes. But few have the courage to start over the right way. And he wished him the same. She smiled, a smile full of pain and relief, and at that moment they both understood that there, in that cold and unadorned room, ended the story that they had tried so many times to keep alive out of attachment and fear. And this closure, although without glory, was what truly freed them. Upon leaving the building, David received a message from Elena, an invitation to an open-air concert that same night. He accepted without hesitation. At night, holding hands with her under a sky full of stars, listening to the soft melody of a violin soloing through the crowd, I knew with absolute certainty that I had made the right choice. Not for revenge, not for pride, but for himself. For the chance to write a new story that wasn't guided by pain, but by the conscious choice to finally be whole. And Laura, in turn, was returning from the city center towards the university, her hair tied up, a folder of documents on the passenger seat and her head full of ideas for a new course she intended to propose. He stopped at a traffic light and, for a moment, observed a couple riding their bicycles, laughing, happy. He smiled discreetly. Not with sadness, but with a hint of longing for what could have been. But also with the peace of someone who finally understands that certain mistakes are not corrected, only understood. And that some losses don't destroy us. They reorganize us. And sometimes, that's all life asks of us. If you made it this far, tell us in the comments, what did you think of this story? Have you ever lived or known someone who went through something similar? We want to know your opinion. And of course, if you like impactful, real stories full of deep emotions like this. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new plots. Every week we have new stories that will move you. And always remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Here, we show how each choice has its consequences. Because the truth, sooner or later, always comes out. Until next time.